Okay, so when I saw that a handful of Taylor Swift fans filed a complaint against Ticketmaster, I basically had this whole plan. I was planning on starting out this video with a bunch of like really cheesy Taylor Swift lines. I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. It's going to be awful. It's going to be cheesy, and it's going to be an absolute delight. I can't do that now because I actually looked at the complaint and it sucks. I'm so sorry. I hate it. I don't like the fact that it sucks, but I have to be honest about it. This lawsuit is not it. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we make sense of the law one bite at a time. Okay, so this lawsuit was filed in California State Court in Los Angeles against Live Nation Entertainment LLC, which does business as Ticketmaster, as well as a bunch of other individuals around Ticketmaster. There are 26 plaintiffs to this case as well, which of course is 4 away from a really good joke about yet another Taylor Swift song. But I can't do it because I don't really feel great about doing too many jokes on this because of the fact that the complaint basically sucks. Now, despite the fact that there are 26 plaintiffs, don't be fooled, this is not a class action complaint. This was a bit of a perplexity to me initially when I was reading the complaint because it seems like, especially because of the fact that there are some antitrust claims that are alleged in this complaint, I would have thought that this would have been a relatively good case for a class action complaint. It wasn't until I started reading through the actual document itself that I realized that this really is not, legally speaking, a very good case. And now before I move any further into the details of what happened or the actual claims that are in the complaint, I want to make it really clear here. I am not here to dump on the Taylor Swift fans, the Swifties as they're known, or Taylor Swift herself. I personally enjoy Taylor Swift's music myself. I've been kind of an on again, off again fan. I have absolutely nothing wrong with her, although I know that she can be something of a divisive character out there on the internet. People have all kinds of opinions one way or another about her. And so I think that sometimes those opinions that people have about the individual, the performer, the celebrity, what have you, that is kind of involved in this whole thing can sometimes shade their opinions of the actual controversy itself. And in fact, I have a lot of empathy for the Swifties that went through a very hard time trying to get tickets to Taylor Swift's most recent tour. I know that this is her first tour since the pandemic, and this is after she had already canceled one tour because of the pandemic. And this is kind of an issue that comes up in the case itself. And I also understand that people have all kinds of stressful things going on in their lives, and people turn to all kinds of things so that they can manage the stresses of their day-to-day lives. And so sometimes that looks like video games, sometimes it looks like movies, sometimes it looks like concert tours. And, so that can come out in a lot of different ways. And if someone is going to be critical of a case like this just because they say, well, who cares about this concert? Who cares about this tour? Who cares about this performer? That's just your personal opinion. And it's not really a good reason, in my opinion, to have a very strong opinion about the lawsuit itself. In other words, as an example, when there was a ton of angst out there on the internet and around the world, I guess you could say, about the fact that people could not get their hands on a PlayStation 5 when it first came out and for months and months and months afterwards, I didn't have any judgment about that either, because that is what some people need in their lives in order to manage their day-to-day stresses, so to speak. And I personally am not about to go around judging what someone else decides to do for their own entertainment, so long as it, of course, is something that is legal, lawful, etc. Okay, so in order to talk about why I think the way that I think about this particular complaint, let's first talk about the background here. What happened that gave rise to this lawsuit in the first place? So you may have heard about this in recent weeks, but Taylor Swift has a new tour called the Eras Tour that recently went on sale after the release of her latest album, Midnights. Although there was quite a bit of anticipation for the tour, there were ways for diehard fans to try to get access to tickets through pre-sales and specific promotions. One of those was by becoming a quote-unquote verified fan. According to the complaint, there were 2 ways to become a verified fan. The first was buying a significant amount of merchandise, and the second was by exchanging the tickets that the person had previously bought for Taylor Swift's Lovers Fest tour. Now, an important detail here is that the Lovers Fest tour was one that Taylor Swift had that was planned for 2021, which she had to officially cancel in February 2021 after she had previously delayed it. And the reason for canceling that was the same reason that pretty much everything got canceled around that time, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. So access to pre-sales of this next tour was supposed to be apparently a way to, soften the blow for these people for having experienced a tour that got canceled on them. But as if it wasn't bad enough that they had to experience having that tour get canceled on them after they had already purchased their tickets before, the TLDR of this whole scenario is that the ticket sales quickly turned into a disaster. According to the complaint, this all went down between November 14th, 2022 and November 18th, 2022. And before I go any further, I should highlight the fact that Taylor Swift and Taylor Swift management did enter into what appears to be an exclusivity contract with Ticketmaster for the sale of the tickets for her The Eras tour in 2022-2023. So all of these purchases were to be made through Ticketmaster. Okay, so on November 14th, 2022, verified fans of the Taylor Swift Tickets presale were to be sent a code to access the presale for the tour. However, according to the complaint, thousands of these fans were either not sent codes or were sent codes that simply didn't work. On top of that, the complaint alleges that Ticketmaster actually issued codes that gave access to the purchase of more seats than what they even had available. In other words, one person that got a code could purchase up to 6 tickets, but there were not enough tickets available during the pre-sale for all of those people to purchase the max amount. In other words, this creates a situation where Ticketmaster really couldn't satisfy the demand, arguably, that they were creating during the pre-sale. At the same time, again, according to the complaint, it says that Ticketmaster gave pre-sale access to 14 million non-verified Ticketmaster users. So people who were apparently not supposed to get access according to the rules laid out for Taylor Swift fans. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if 14 million is the correct number or if they meant to say 1.4 million. There are a number of typos in this complaint, and there was another point in the complaint also that referenced a 1.4 million. So I don't know if 14 million is intentional or if that's a typo with a decimal. But anyway, again, according to the complaint, all of this meant that even for those Swifties who did get pre-sale codes, millions of them waited for up to 8 hours and were still not able to get tickets from the pre-sale when it opened up on November 15th, 2022. In addition to this, apparently after the presale opened up on November 15th, Ticketmaster was supposed to give access on November 16th to people who hold a credit card from Capital One before they opened up general ticket sales on November 18th, 2022. However, on November 17th, 2022, the day before general sales were supposed to open up, Ticketmaster announced that they were canceling the general sale, citing an insufficient quality of the remaining tickets. The plaintiffs here say that this is all the fault of Ticketmaster. They say that Ticketmaster intentionally misled and defrauded purchasers in a handful of ways. One of these ways is that they say that Ticketmaster allowed scalpers and bots access to the pre-sale and the Capital One sale, and that they allowed tickets to be resold during Taylor Swift Tickets pre-sale. And note, resale of these tickets is limited to a secondary resale market that is controlled by Ticketmaster. In other words, Ticketmaster apparently had a rule saying that any resale of these tickets had to be done within their closed system. The complaint further alleges that Ticketmaster allowed these bots and scalpers to remove tickets from a fan's basket without allowing them adequate time to complete the sale. And what's more, the complaint also alleges that Ticketmaster allowed all of this while knowingly creating the illusion that resale tickets were put up at face value as if negotiated by Taylor Swift management, when in fact they were double and triple of the negotiated price. And finally, the complaint highlights that Ticketmaster has an ultimate benefit in having this sort of skyrocketing of prices because Ticketmaster is paid again in additional fees every time a ticket is resold. One thing to note is that the complaint doesn't exactly make it clear how Ticketmaster actually makes this money on the resale, whether it's a flat fee per transaction or if it's a certain percentage of the overall price of the ticket, or maybe some kind of a combination of both. If it's a percentage of the overall ticket, then yeah, I would agree that they are highly incentivized to bump up these prices by insane amounts. But as I'm reading this, I think that if this is a simple transaction fee that is basically a flat fee that Ticketmaster charges per transaction, per resale, it's not necessarily supportive of this particular proposition that Ticketmaster has this big bad interest in having these prices just go absolutely through the roof. But anyway, with that slight divergence aside, basically there are three main theories of liability that the complaint alleges, which is broken up into a bunch of different causes of action. So the good thing is we can basically simplify this into three main subjects, and that is fraud, breach of contract, and anti-competitive behaviors in violation of a number of antitrust laws. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, but none of these are particularly strong arguments in my opinion. And I think that the legal team here flat out misunderstands antitrust law, to be honest. Okay, so let's start with the antitrust law situation here. Okay, so when we're talking about antitrust laws, we're talking about monopolization, we're talking about tying, we're talking about a number of things that can get relatively complicated pretty quickly. It's very easy to get lost in the weeds in this area of law. So I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. And I guess fortunately for my purposes, but unfortunately for the plaintiffs here, the attorneys in this case seem to have gotten a relatively fundamental part of antitrust laws wrong here. So I think keeping it simple is going to be probably the best route anyway. So the overall aim of antitrust law is to ensure fair competition between businesses so that the consumers aren't harmed by having one company just take complete control over the marketplace and just completely gouge prices for all consumers until the end of time. Allowing for competition between businesses is one of the best ways to keep prices low so that consumers can have, relatively fair prices for the things that they buy. But note that the purpose of antitrust law is not to force businesses to compete with one another, but rather to prevent one business from unfairly keeping other businesses out of the market. And so when we're looking at the activities of a particular business, what we're looking for is anti-competitive behavior. And so this complaint does allege that Ticketmaster is engaging in anti-competitive behavior. However, what it says that Ticketmaster is doing that the complaint classifies as anti-competitive behavior doesn't exactly fit with what antitrust law actually tries to protect or prevent. Specifically, the complaint alleges that the anti-competitive behavior that Ticketmaster engaged in was that they forced fans of musicians to exclusively use Ticketmaster for presale and sales prices, which are above what a competitive market price should be. In other words, what they're saying is that Ticketmaster is gouging the prices for the consumers. In other words, the picture that this complaint is trying to paint with this particular allegation is one of monopolization. Now, monopolization is not a good thing. That is in violation of antitrust laws. And there are two basic elements of monopolization. Number one is possession of monopoly power in the relevant market. So, first question is this company, relatively speaking, a monopoly? However, being a monopoly on its own is not enough to violate antitrust laws. There is that second element, which also has to be met, and that is willful acquisition or maintenance of that monopoly power as distinguished from attaining it by having a superior product, business acumen, or even an accident in history. In other words, they're engaging in behavior that is actively preventing other companies from being able to fairly compete with them to try to, bring prices down and whatnot. So the behavior is generally going to be targeted towards other businesses, towards other potential competitors to Ticketmaster. The behavior isn't going to be targeted at consumers, generally speaking. So even though Ticketmaster is arguably charging these prices to consumers, and the complaint is alleging that Ticketmaster is charging them above what they should be, that's not anti-competitive behavior under the antitrust laws. Is it crappy from a consumer's perspective? Of course, but it's not unlawful. I'll get into a little bit more detail as to why in just a second, but let me first talk a little bit about the other anti-competitive behavior that the complaint alleges. And that is entering the secondary ticket market. In other words, resale of the tickets that are sold off of Ticketmaster. Remember that I mentioned that Ticketmaster requires that any resale of these tickets have to be done through Ticketmaster's secondary ticket exchange. So the complaint alleges that this is an unlawful tying between two separate products that basically would be independent of one another, and that therefore, as a result, the consumers are harmed. There are a number of issues with this. Number one is the definition of tying. Basically, tying is where the seller of one product conditions the sale of that product to the sale of another product. In other words, where the seller says, if you want to buy this product, you also have to buy this other product. Now, first of all, tying exists quite a bit in the current marketplace across all industries. If you want to buy something that is a bundled series of products, you can get things like that at Costco any day of the week. That is not unlawful. It's when it starts to screw around with the overall market that things start to get unlawful under antitrust laws. But even with that analysis aside, both this alleged anti-competitive behavior and the previous one, the one about alleged monopolization of the ticket sales and whatnot, both of those are really undercut by the fact that the sale of these tickets through Ticketmaster is because of an exclusive contract between Taylor Swift and Taylor Swift Management and Ticketmaster. Now, to a certain extent, every single contract that exists is in theory a monopolization of a certain product. That is especially true of exclusivity agreements. For example, Spotify essentially has a monopoly on all content coming out of the Joe Rogan Experience. And that's because he signed an exclusivity contract with Spotify for however many years to do his podcast through that platform. If problems arise with the way in which Spotify puts out that content, then there are issues that come up with that, but that's not necessarily a monopoly issue. It's not necessarily a tying issue. It's not necessarily an antitrust issue, in other words. And the way I see it, this is very similar to this current situation with Taylor Swift, where she has what appears to be an exclusivity agreement with Ticketmaster for the sale of her tickets for this tour. So that's the antitrust claims here. I don't see those really going far at all. But what about the other two? There's breach of contract and there's fraud claims. So let's talk first about the breach of contract claims. The complaint alleges that the fans entered into a contract of sorts with Ticketmaster by buying merchandise and or exchanging their tickets from the prior tour. And so the complaint alleges that Ticketmaster breached that contract by failing to actually provide the proper presale as promised. Looking at this part of the complaint in a light that is most favorable to the plaintiffs here, one could argue that the thing that the plaintiffs here were promised was not just access to a Taylor Swift concert, but this particular Taylor Swift concert. An argument can be made that because each tour features possibly different music, maybe Taylor Swift changes up her performance over time. Who knows if something is going to happen in the future that will prevent future tours from existing. All of these things can point to the argument that this is a unique experience that they were promised by Ticketmaster. But that does lead to really the main question that I have here, which is, did the plaintiffs actually give something up here in consideration of that promise? In other words, did they do anything to change their own behavior in order to get what Ticketmaster was offering? Let's look first at the merch issue. If the merchandise promotion actually induced a change in the behavior of the plaintiffs here, in other words, if they say that they wouldn't have bought merchandise or they wouldn't have bought as much merchandise as they actually did, if not for this promotion, if not for the prospect of getting to partake in the pre-sale of these tickets for this particular tour, then I would argue, yeah, there is a contract here that the plaintiffs can probably rely on in this particular complaint. On the other hand, however, if they were already engaging in that behavior and they found out on the back end of these purchases that there was this perk because they had bought so much merch from Taylor Swift, then arguably there is no contract because there was nothing that changed their behavior. In other words, they didn't do anything differently without this other offer out there. If the Ticketmaster offer didn't exist, they still would have bought that March nonetheless. And the same thing is true for the Lovers Fest ticket exchange. It's unclear from my reading of the complaint as to whether there was, in light of the cancellation of the previous tour, any kind of an offer where the people that had bought tickets to the previous tour could either get a full refund for their tickets or hold on to the previous tickets and get this pre-sale offer for the next tour. If there was this kind of an offer that they could choose one way or another, maybe that could create a contract. But on the other hand, if it was just Taylor Swift or Ticketmaster basically saying, hey, I'm so sorry, pandemics suck, cancellations suck, no one wants this, but, here's something to kind of soften the blow that next time, hopefully things can be made a little bit better for you because you went through this thing. That, in my opinion, does not create a contract because it doesn't change any of the behavior on the part of the plaintiffs. And as for this particular avenue of becoming a verified fan, it looks like that actually is the case as to what happened here. Paragraph 81 of this complaint says, Ticketmaster also benefited from their misleading the buyers of the canceled Taylor Swift Loverfest tour by making similar promises to these buyers, which included some plaintiffs. Ticketmaster was able to appease any issue these buyers and plaintiffs had with Ticketmaster's handling of the prior tour following its cancellation due to COVID-19. In other words, there's nothing in this complaint saying that Ticketmaster is responsible for the cancellation of the previous tour. It just says that people were kind of unhappy with how Ticketmaster handled the cancellation of the tour and that Ticketmaster was trying to appease the discontent of these particular buyers. However, it's important to note here that Ticketmaster was doing this arguably to make Taylor Swift happy, not so much the actual buyers themselves. I say that because the buyers don't have any kind of a say as to whether or not the next tour goes through Ticketmaster. That decision is completely in Taylor Swift's hands. And so because of that, Ticketmaster could kind of say almost, maybe not anything, but almost anything that they want to appease the emotions of these particular buyers in this kind of a moment. But when an event like this is canceled due to something like a global pandemic, arguably they're not under any obligation to refund all of these, or to give any kind of benefits to the people that have missed out on an experience themselves. So that's the breach of contract claim. Then there is the intentional misrepresentation / fraud claims. And I have to say, these claims don't really do much better. To explain why, let's first go through the elements of intentional misrepresentation or fraud. So in order for there to be fraud, there have to be 5 things. Those are misrepresentation by the defendant, defendant's knowledge of the falsity of the representation, defendant's intent to defraud, plaintiff's justifiable reliance on defendant's representations, and resulting damage. And I really want to focus on number 3 of these elements because I think that this is probably the most important point here. It's the intent to deceive that is really important here. There has to be specific intent to deceive that has to be shown. And it's what distinguishes fraud from negligent misrepresentation, which is actionable but not alleged here, and innocent misrepresentation, which is not an actionable claim at all. So in this particular case, without intent here, in other words, if Ticketmaster just royally screwed up through a series of errors or incompetencies, there's no fraud here. That's not something that can be shown in this particular case without intent. And when it comes to a company like this with multiple levels of bureaucracy and administration, a lot of decision makers, intent is arguably going to be pretty hard to prove here. And at the end of the day, the reality here is that when we pull the scope back from these individual claims, all of this really kind of comes down to the reality that most of this lawsuit is really undercut by the fact that in this particular case, Taylor Swift entered into an exclusivity contract with Ticketmaster, as is her right. This is her tour, it's her product, and she can decide who she works with on these particular tours in all different levels of the administration and execution of the project. So to my mind, as far as this particular lawsuit is concerned, the one piece that I think might have some survivability really is the breach of contract claim as to the merchandise purchasing ahead of time for the pre-sale. Other than that, I don't really see this lawsuit being particularly successful. And at the end of the day, it seems like the best way for this kind of an issue to be prevented in the future is kind of down to Taylor Swift herself. I do understand that she does put herself out there as somebody who is very protective of her fan base. And so this really could be a moment for her to decide whether or not to work with Ticketmaster in the future. Obviously, that comes down to whether that is feasible from a business perspective. If there are other companies out there that could be actual competitors to Ticketmaster or could become disruptors to Ticketmaster's market, she can decide to work exclusively with another company in order to effectuate the sales of her tickets for her next tour. In other words, she can basically tell Ticketmaster that we are never, ever, ever getting back together. I'm sorry, I'll see myself out. Okay, I admit I couldn't completely resist. I'm sorry. But of course, those are my thoughts. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or maybe informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with those YouTube algorithm gods. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this and you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next video.